Railways have always had unconventional ways of moving passengers in a pinch, from letting them ride in wagons to sharing space in the guard's van. When the passenger services of France, however, were in need of some more rolling stock, the solution the railway came up with was to start carrying passengers around in chicken coops. By the late 1800s, the company des Chemins de Fer du Nord was in need of a better way of dealing with suburban passenger traffic on their network. While the Nord wasn't very big, its network was very densely populated, which necessitated running more frequent, shorter distance passenger services. The only issue was that regulations were very strict on what was required to run a passenger service, such as having a dedicated baggage van be positioned between the engine and the carriages. Something that wasn't ideal for frequently stopping services and meant time had to be spent shunting trains around at the end of the line. In 1885, the Nord gained permission to run tram trains around Lille. These services were limited to smaller rolling stock but didn't require all the extras like baggage vans, making them much more efficient for suburban work. A conductor would be on board to sell tickets, allowing passengers to be picked up and dropped off anywhere without the need for dedicated stations and the staff that came with them. These services worked well, and in 1889 the Nord got permission to run these services elsewhere on their network. To make services more efficient, the Nord built specialised coaches that were essentially three smaller carriages permanently connected together forming one unit, allowing conductors to safely traverse along the train while moving instead of having to risk jumping between carriages, as corridor coaches weren't widely adopted yet. These specialised coaches, however, had their drawbacks, mostly to do with how awkward they were to maintain, and so the Nord was keen to find something that could accommodate plenty of people while still requiring a minimal amount of crew to operate, didn't need to be turned around at the end of the line, and wasn't too complex to maintain. Railcars had proven to be capable of meeting these demands on other railways around France, and so in 1901 the Nord decided to build railcars of their own. Built as a collaboration between Buffard and Rabatel and the Chapelle Works, this new railcar was essentially a small tank locomotive positioned between two four-wheeled carriages in a similar manner to a push-pull service. Only the carriages and the engine were semi-permanently connected to one another. The locomotive itself was an 022 with 1040mm driving wheels, a turbine boiler and a pair of supposedly compound cylinders, the high-pressure one measuring 195 by 320mm and the low-pressure one 250 by 320mm. Despite the size of the overall unit, the boiler was surprisingly small, measuring 2038mm in length and capable of producing 14 bar. The cab was set in the middle of the locomotive and raised to give the driver a better view over the tops of the carriages. On top of that, the cab had two driving positions arranged so that the driver would always be seated on the left facing the direction of travel, making it easier to see signals ahead. The rear end of the locomotive was fitted with a dedicated luggage compartment, while the boiler at the front was enclosed to help the engine blend in with the rest of the carriages. The locomotive wasn't the only unusual thing about the railcar, as the carriage units had a strange design of their own. To help improve the driver's view, the carriage bodies were made to be 2.41 meters wide instead of the standard 3.2 and offset to the right, leaving space on the left-hand side of the carriage so as to give the driver a better view of the signals ahead. To make up for the lack of room inside the carriages, segmented luggage compartments were fitted on the outside on the left for passengers to store their bags in. These compartments were fitted with wire mesh doors and combined with the unusual appearance of the carriages earned them the nickname of Chicken Coops. Despite their unusual appearance, the passenger compartments were surprisingly comfortable, being fitted with steam heating provided by the locomotive and an open design giving passengers enough space to move if needed. The carriages had first, second and third class accommodation, with the front carriage having 8 first class seats and 14 second class, while the rear carriage was entirely third class, with space for roughly 30 people to sit and standing space for another 30 people between the two carriages. The seats were benches set on either side of the length of the carriage, leaving a walkway down the middle, with the seats in first and second class being more cushioned than the plain wooden benches of third. An additional 6 third-class seats were installed in the luggage compartment of the locomotive, but one can imagine that these were scarcely used. Classed as VV, 3 were initially built for use on the Paris-Saint Denis line and were found to be reliable machines. They could produce roughly 100 horsepower and had a top speed of 75 km an hour, all while only consuming roughly 6 to 7 kilograms of coal per kilometre travelled. Their efficiency meant that the driver could maintain the fire without the aid of a fireman, saving on staff, and the corridor design allowed conductors to safely and easily access both the front and rear carriages. Another benefit was maintenance. With most railcars, the locomotive and carriage space all being part of the same unit usually made maintenance an issue, as carriage workshops weren't equipped to overhaul the engine and locomotive works usually resulted in the passenger areas getting filthy. Despite working as one unit, the passenger cars and the locomotive could be disconnected from each other, allowing workers to easily maintain both separately. Pleased with their performance, the Nord ordered an additional 8 in 1908 for use around Valenciennes, Creil, and Saint-Just-en-Justy, the design of these being slightly modified to make them more powerful and remove the use of compound cylinders. Their unique design and reliability earned them a place at the World Exhibitions in Brussels in 1910, and all 11 continued to work until the 1930s. By then, however, their flaws were starting to come through. The original Turgon boilers were replaced with standard boilers in 1905 for ease of maintenance, and it's likely the rest of their units had their decorative boiler casings removed for the same reason. Another issue was how cramped they were compared to other standard carriages and rail cars. While the narrower offset bodies did provide the driver with a better view, it came at the cost of passenger space, something that would have been greatly felt during busier days. The positioning of the cab also meant that simply attaching another carriage wasn't really viable to make up for it. The driver's view was very limited even with the extra visibility the Chicken Coop carriages provided, and coupling on an extra carriage would have rendered the odd design pointless when travelling in that direction. That is, unless the driver took the time to shunt the carriage to the rear of the train at the end of the line, but that would be a waste of time and defeat the entire point of the railcars in the first place. Not to mention that most other contemporary railcars struggle to pull any additional carriages or wagons, so it's not unlikely that the VVs would have lacked the strength to pull an extra carriage anyway. On top of that, I think it's fair to say that their most defining feature, the outside luggage cages, wouldn't have been popular on wet days or in other such adverse weather on account of the wire mesh doors. All this to say that despite their unique appearance and seeming practicality, they weren't exactly the ideal suburban machines that the Nord needed. They proved to be unpopular with many younger passengers, and their lack of flexibility left them overshadowed by many other locomotives and railcar designs. As such, withdrawals had begun by 1930, and by 1932 all of them had been taken out of service from Gare du Nord, though one source states that they kept working until the 1940s, with all of their seating being downgraded to third class in 1939, the last being withdrawn in 1946. Regardless, all of them were eventually scrapped and none of them were preserved. Whether you love or hate steam railcars, it's impossible to deny that the Chicken Coop design of VVs 1 to 11 was perhaps one of the more unique and interesting takes on the idea. They weren't by any means perfect, but they certainly must have been quite the spectacle pulling into the station on a busy day. Makes me wonder if anyone ever pulled out a nest filled with eggs when they retrieved their luggage. Subscribe for more.